The following testimony can be found in the Safety of Life and Property at Sea hearing from the March 1935 hearing before the Committee on Merchant Marine and Fisheries of the House of Representatives. The steamship Mohawk left port with 3 feet of snow piled up around the lifeboats and davits. It has been testified to by various members of the crews that the Marine Superintendent of the Ward Line was on board the vessel, looking straight at the men, while they piled snow and ice around the davits. It was also testified that various individuals slipped on the snow and ice into the water.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? A cold collision for the Mohawk.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The 5,896-ton steel-hulled steamer, the Mohawk, was launched in 1926. The last of 3 identical sister ships built for the Clyde-Mallory Line, the other 2 being named the Seminole and the Cherokee. It was noted that, unlike many ships of her time, despite it being prohibition, she was christened with a bottle of wine, which was expected to bring the ship more luck. The newspapers said that the workers of the shipyard stood under where the ship was christened with their hands out, hoping to catch some of the wine as it ran down the side of the ship. The Mohawk and her sister ships were launched with high expectations and built at great expense. They were fast, they offered every comfort possible to a large number of passengers of all classes, and their cargo holds featured facilities to transport cars, as well as refrigeration to transport perishable cargo between southern and northern markets. The Mohawk was put to work traveling up and down the Atlantic coast. In early 1935, the Mohawk got a new assignment under a new company. Though she was still a Clyde-Mallory ship, she was chartered in January of 1935 by the Ward Line for their New York to Havana route. The Ward Line had just experienced a few rough months. First, one of their most famous ships, the Morro Castle, had burnt with a high cost of life, much of which was considered preventable and called into question by the public as well as the government. Then their ship, the Havana, had gone off course by 20 miles, for reasons no one could find, and became stranded on a reef off the coast of Florida. With their string of bad luck, the Ward Line was in need of another ship to work on its popular New York to Havana route, and looked to the Clyde-Mallory Line for just such a ship. After all, both of them were subsidiaries of the same Atlantic, Gulf, and West Indies steamship lines. On the afternoon of the 24th of January, 1935, the Mohawk left New York with 54 passengers on board for her first voyage as part of the Ward Line. It was not even close to full capacity, but she was also carrying general cargo and a crew of 110. The crew was a mix of Clyde-Mallory sailors and Ward Line sailors. The Mohawk's captain for the voyage was Captain Wood, a captain with 30 years of experience working for the Clyde-Mallory Line, while at least some of the sailors had been transferred only days before from the Ward Line ship, the Havana, which was still stranded. The people on board the Mohawk had something to look forward to from the trip, an escape from the cold that had descended on the East Coast. As they left New York, it was 5 degrees Fahrenheit. A heavy blizzard had taken place, and preparing the ship to set sail had been a struggle. For much of the 23rd and into the 24th, the sailors of the ship had been employed shoveling off the boat deck, but there was too much for just them. The shore gang came on board to help, and they got started on the top deck, right above the boat deck, and soon they had shoveled the snow from the top deck right down on top of the boats. In the defense of the shore gang, they had been ordered to do so. When they were throwing the snow overboard, it had landed on the people loading the cargo onto the ship on the pier, and there was concern that this would delay departure. The sailors who had been working on shoveling free the boat deck were forced to clear a path to the outside of the deckhouse so that people could travel from bow to stern without braving snow up to their waists. The sailors were going to shovel more, but they were given the order to stop. The passageway was enough, and they were going to need to depart soon. It was noted that during this, Talisman, the marine superintendent, had walked around the deck several times and found no fault with the way that there was snow being left on the lifeboats. It was also noted that in spite of his position, Talisman had no sea experience at all. So it was that the Mohawk departed from New York, with the crew still struggling through the snow and scrambling to get tasks done that were meant to be done before they departed. The passengers noted some of the disorganization of the crew and ship as they began their voyage. One woman asked one of the stewards what had happened when dinner was served an hour later than scheduled, and it was told that it was because the ship was just out of dry dock, and much of it had not been put in order yet, including the galley. There was more to it than just that, though. Many members of the crew had only been assigned to the ship 2 days before, and they were still learning the details of the ship and any quirks that she had. They would soon find some other things that had been overlooked in the hurry to get the Mohawk to work. One of the ship's quartermasters, Thomas Charles, had the wheel from 4 to 8 at night. He was among those who had been on the Havana, and before that had served on the Mohawk Castle. Just as the Wardline had a string of bad luck, so too did Thomas Charles. He was one of the men who had just come on board on the 22nd, and so he did not know the complete history of the ship. As he turned the wheel, though, he noticed it was stiff, and when he was relieved at 8 p.m., he communicated this to the third mate. Charles then went to bed, unaware that nothing was being done about the issue, and that it was not a new problem to the Mohawk at all. A year before, on a cold night, the Mohawk had been steered into New York using the emergency steering because her wheel had suddenly stopped responding. The Mohawk had stopped off Sandy Hook to drop off her pilot and to calibrate her new radio compass. While she was stopped, several ships passed by her, including a Norwegian freighter named the Talisman, heading from New York to South America. The night was clear, and there was no difficulty in seeing the other ships pass by them. The Mohawk was soon steaming forward again, traveling at her full speed of 14 knots. The quartermaster who took over for Charles, a man named Marty Polaner, also immediately noticed how stiff the wheel was and commented on it to the third mate. The third mate did not respond, but instead walked away, leaving Polaner to continue fighting with the wheel, which got more and more stiff as the next half hour passed. The third mate did eventually tinker with the steering system, but he could see nothing wrong, and so let it be for a little while longer. Around 8:30 at night, Polaner found that it was now completely impossible to steer the ship, and he told the third officer that he could no longer be responsible for the course of the ship since he could not steer. The third mate went to tell Captain Wood, but on finding out that he was not in his quarters but was instead with passengers, he did not report the issue, and instead came back with the engineer, who closed a couple of valves but could see nothing wrong. The wheel responded for a little while, but not accurately, and it was clearly getting worse again. The engineer went below to prepare the emergency steering equipment. By the time Captain Wood entered the bridge, Polaner was keeping an eye on the ship's course, but was completely unable to steer the ship again, and the emergency steering equipment was still not ready. Captain Wood did not say anything to Polaner, and it was later speculated that he had still not been told that there was anything wrong with the steering equipment. The Mohawk steamed past the charred hulk of the Mohawk Castle, where it still rested after being run aground, and slowly drew side by side with the Talisman which had previously passed her. The Mohawk was a faster ship and was gradually drawing ahead when all of a sudden, and without warning to anyone on either ship, the Mohawk veered sharply to port. There are two theories. One is that the malfunctioning steering had finally gone entirely haywire. Another is that the emergency steering was finally online, but the engineer at it misinterpreted the steering instructions that were given to him by a ship telegraph because the old signals were posted on the emergency steering equipment, not the new ones that had been updated 9 months before. One of the sailors on watch, a man named Burnett, was the first to notice, and he shouted a warning to the officers on the bridge as he saw them swing towards the Talisman. As soon as Captain Wood had verified it for himself, he frantically blew a series of blasts on their whistle as warning, but it was far too late. The Talisman's bow struck the Mohawk's side near the bow at a right angle, tearing into the ship and creating a gaping hole before bouncing off. 2 of the sailors who had been sleeping were crushed, and water was soon pouring in. Someone on the Talisman shouted something to Captain Wood. No one heard what it was, but Captain Wood answered no, and the Talisman was soon limping away. In rough condition, but still afloat. Captain Wood sent several sailors who came for orders in the face of the accident to go and assess the damage to the ship. The sailors went and found the state of the forecastle and saw how quickly the ship was flooding. One of the sailors had the particularly alarming discovery that his bunk had been sliced in half, and that if he had not been on duty, he would have shared the same fate as his friends who had been crushed. The sailor Burnett went to see if he could find out exactly how much water the ship had taken on, but he was unable to because the hatch on the well to take soundings was jammed and could not be lifted. The sailors went back and reported to Captain Wood the situation, who ordered an SOS sent out, ordered the engine to be slowed, and ordered the lifeboats to be prepared. At almost the exact same time that they sent out their SOS message, the Talisman also sent one out. It was enough to draw the attention of all passing shipping. As soon as the Mohawk slowed, Captain Wood told the crew to swing out all of the lifeboats and load all of the passengers into them. For the passengers, it was a disorienting experience. At one moment, they were listening to the orchestra play "I Saw Stars" in the lounge or playing bridge in the smoking room. And the next moment, the crew was herding them to the deck after a terrible crash had rocked the ship. Both the crew and the passengers were credited with remaining and behaving well. Even the members of the crew who had been asleep when the crash had occurred had quickly put on their clothing and rushed to do what they could. It would take all of the help they could get to launch the boats. The lifeboats were still covered in snow, and since there were no shovels, the crew was forced to dig them out by hand in the freezing temperatures. The canvas covers on the boats were frozen stiff and had to be broken loose. The cranks that were supposed to swing the boats out were only supposed to require 1 man, but it was taking up to 5 men to move them, they were so rusted, and many of them had to be hit with fire axes to get them to even start moving. The chains had also rusted badly and had clearly not been oiled at any time in recent history. One of the sailors would later say that, based on the condition of the boats, he would think that the most recent the boats had been swung out must have been 6 months before, and clearly no maintenance had been done. They had also not been checked by the ward line when the line had taken possession of the ship, even though they had been told that she had been laid up and not in use. At a time when every moment was precious, it was taking 15 minutes for the crew to launch each boat, and while they were able to split up and launch multiple at a time, it was still too long. At least one boat was impossible to launch. Even though they hit the cranks and multiple people threw themselves against it, it was unmovable. There was no sense of relief that came with the launching of the boats. New troubles appeared instead. Once the boats had been launched, they found that among the other things that had not been properly provided were enough ladders that would allow people to reach them. Many people were forced to jump into the freezing water and swim to the boats instead. Other people accidentally slipped on the ice around the boats and fell into the water. Not all of them reached the surface again. The gear for the lifeboats had also not been lashed in the lifeboats, so once people reached the lifeboats, they found that if they did ever have gear, it was thrown into the ocean. Some boats only had 2 oars. Many of them were missing oarlocks. Some of the boats were half full of water and did not have buckets that could be used to bail. On the boat that Quartermaster Charles found himself in, they tried to use the sea anchor, only to find that it was entirely rotten and unusable. It took 35 minutes for the first boat to depart from the side of the sinking Mohawk after the collision. Burnett was still on the ship as she developed a 45-degree list to starboard, still trying to do everything to help people to the lifeboats. He was among the people who slipped on the thick ice on the deck and fell, but in his case he was lucky enough to fall into the number 9 lifeboat, which he had just helped to lower. Once he was in the boat, he helped pull up 4 other sailors who had jumped into the water. Their boat had no oarlocks at all, and while they did have flares, they could not be opened because of how long they had been in the boat unused. There were also no hatchets on board. There were supposed to be 2, and they were just lucky that one of the sailors had a pocket knife that he could use to cut the boat's painter so that they could free the sinking ship. Without a bucket to bail, they were now forced to endure in knee-deep water, unsure of how long they would be floating directionless and without a way to draw attention to themselves. In spite of the difficulties, the crew of the Mohawk was able to get all of the passengers off of the ship, and most of the crew had also reached the boats before the Mohawk finally gave up the fight against the water that was rushing into her and sank for good. About 40 minutes after the collision, Captain Wood sent out one final telegraph. "If you can pick up our boats, do so." He knew that ships were coming, but he also knew that they were not going to come fast enough to see the Mohawk afloat. She went down bow first, making a strong impression on the people who were watching from the boats against the moonlight. Captain Wood was seen standing on the bridge until the end, unwilling to leave his ship. The people in the boats could only hope that help would soon answer their SOS. The first ship to arrive about an hour and a half after the collision was the Algonquin, another ship that was part of the Clyde Mallory line. The United fruit liner Lamond and the Coast Guard cutter USS Champlain also rushed to the scene to help. All but one boat was found in the end, but in each case, the least they had been floating was an hour, and sometimes it was several hours. The people in the boat with Burnett had the frustrating experience of floating around the bow of the Lamond for an hour without anyone seeing or hearing them until the moon came out and they were finally spotted. The bitter cold, mixed with the wet people with no ability to warm themselves, meant that not everyone was able to be rescued before they succumbed to the extreme temperatures. 45 people were lost due to sinking of the Mohawk, 15 passengers and 30 members of the crew. Most of these people had reached the boats but were not able to survive injuries sustained while jumping from the ship or the cold temperatures in the boats. The people who were pulled onto the ships that came to the rescue almost all had various degrees of frostbite, in many cases resulting in permanent injuries or posing a serious threat to their lives. The ships rushed back to New York with the survivors of the Mohawk on board, most of whom were immediately placed in hospitals around the city due to their need of immediate medical attention. The Talisman eventually also limped into New York, but all hopes were dashed of her carrying survivors. She had not been able to rescue anyone. The lawyers from the ward line acted quickly. In spite of how scattered the survivors were on reaching the city, the representatives of the ward line swiftly found them. They came out and met the Algonquin, and their trip was not one of goodwill. They warned every member of their crew not to speak to anyone, but to instead immediately report to the ward offices. They also did what they could to ensure the passengers were isolated and not speaking. At least one passenger said that the representative on the ward line had insisted on putting him in a private hospital room, even though he had protested that he did not want to be alone after such an experience. He told people later that the ward line representative had assured him that he wanted quiet and, more importantly, not to speak to anyone. They even found the people who had not needed to be hospitalized calling places like the Seamen's Institute to tell the sailors to come into the offices. Quartermaster Charles, in particular, was not interested in what they had to say, and first put himself up in a hotel, and when they had found him and called him there, he spent 3 days at the Seamen's Institute, hoping they would leave him alone. Unfortunately, he had lost everything in the wreck, and he was finally forced to go to the ward line in the hope of some clothing to replace what he had lost. They gave him a suit, but he had to literally beg them for an overcoat. They informed him that they would only give him an overcoat if he made a statement with their lawyers. He agreed in exchange for the coat, but once he had made the statement, he refused to sign it and was immediately cut off from all further support from the line. It did not take long for the crew and passengers of the Mohawk to begin to organize a committee, with the hope of not only making the ward line take responsibility for what had happened, as well as trying to force general sweeping reforms to ship safety. They soon merged with the survivor committee that had been formed by the people who had been on the Mohawk Castle. It was a combination that made sense, and in many cases there was an overlap of crew that had served on the two ships, and so they were able to speak on what had gone wrong on both. In spite of the ward line cutting off the support of anyone who had worked for them who joined the Committee of Survivors, they soon had a lot of evidence against the practices of the ward line from sailors who had decided that they would do what they thought was right, even if it meant they would no longer have financial support. Matters would eventually come to a head in a hearing in front of the House of Representatives, who also could not ignore the number of shipping tragedies that had occurred in the recent past. The findings in the hearing were scathing against the ward line. It was explained by one expert that the steering on the Mohawk used glycerin as its fluid. Too thick and it would be too stiff to steer. Too thin and it would freeze. It seemed as though the glycerin on the steering mechanism of the Mohawk had been too thin for at least over a year and never corrected. The rush to get the Mohawk to work without any proper inspection was also highlighted, as was the attempts by the ward line to silence all witnesses against them. Quartermaster Charles testified that the ward line had told him that if he spoke against them, he would be blacklisted from all of the shipping lines in New York, and they seemingly were true to their word since he had not been able to work since the Mohawk. He did not think anything would change, however, if no one spoke against them, and he was willing to take the risk. In any case, he was now a nervous wreck after experiencing the Mohawk Castle, Havana, and the Mohawk, and was not sure if he would be able to work even if he could find a job. At one point, one member of the committee commented that it seemed as though the officers of the Mohawk had less sense than the average driver on the street. If a man driving a car noticed his steering was acting up, he would stop his car until he got it fixed. The Mohawk had kept going at full speed, regardless of the danger. That the blame for the collision rested completely on the Mohawk was undeniable. The Talisman had no way of responding quickly enough to avoid her. It was hard to find fault with the officers of the Mohawk, though. They had done what they could in spite of terrible company culture that was highlighted not only by the disaster of the Mohawk, but also the burning of the Mohawk Castle. It seemed possible that, rather than not wanting to stop the Mohawk for repairs, the crew felt as though they were not able to. It was pointed out that, on the Mohawk, they had at least quickly sent out an SOS, in spite of the ward line not approving the use of SOS because they did not want to pay salvage costs to responding ships. The Ward Line assured the public that they still had 3 passenger ships left, and they soon chartered the Algonquin to replace the Mohawk, which had replaced the Havana. It was no use, though. The Ward Line was now generally agreed to be a poorly managed and dangerous line, if not an actually cursed one by the public as a whole. The Ward Line's reputation and business was past all salvage.
For more information, please see Time magazine from February 4th, 1935, or see other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.